Before we continue, like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy this type of content and want to see more in the future, and write in the comments where you are listening from. I love reading all the comments. Let's begin. There are certain thinkers in the history of philosophy who are not just figures to be studied, but forces to be reckoned with. They are the great earthquakes of the mind, whose ideas have so profoundly shaken the foundations of our world that nothing can ever be the same again. And there is perhaps no more powerful, no more brilliant, and no more dangerous earthquake in the last 200 years than the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He is a thinker of almost unparalleled psychological insight, a writer of breathtaking literary power, and a prophet of the modern age. To truly respect a philosopher of this magnitude, to take their ideas seriously, is not to engage in blind worship or unthinking devotion. It is to do them the great honor of wrestling with them, of questioning their assumptions, of testing their conclusions, and of confronting the most difficult and most dangerous implications of their thought. This series, therefore, is not an attack on Nietzsche. It is an act of profound and critical respect, an attempt to understand the full and often terrifying power of his philosophy by subjecting it to a rigorous and honest critique. Nietzsche himself would have demanded nothing less. He had nothing but contempt for passive followers and unthinking disciples. He did not see himself as a gentle sage, a purveyor of comforting truths. He saw himself as a destructive, world-shattering, and history-altering force. In his strange and brilliant autobiography, Ex Homo, he famously declared, "I am not a man, I am dynamite," a statement of such immense, almost insane arrogance that it can only be matched by its profound and terrifying truth. He saw it as his great historical mission to be the one who philosophizes with a hammer, to be the first great immoralist, the man who would finally expose the 2,000-year-old lie that he believed was at the heart of Western civilization, the life-denying slave morality of Platonism and Christianity. He did not come to bring peace. He came to bring a war of spirits, a revaluation of all values that he knew would tear the world apart. He knew that his name would one day be associated with something monstrous, that great wars would be fought in his name, and he did not shrink from this. He welcomed it as proof of his own world historical importance. And so, we must ask the question, why is he so dangerous? Why do his ideas, more than those of almost any other philosopher, seem to carry within them this explosive, world-altering potential? The first reason is his radical and deeply unsettling critique of truth itself. With his philosophy of perspectivism, he argues that there are no objective facts, only interpretations. This can be a liberating idea, freeing us from the tyranny of dogma, but it also threatens to dissolve the very ground of our shared reality, leaving us adrift in a sea of competing and equally baseless narratives. The second reason is his direct and ferocious assault on compassion. His critique of pity, of love for one's neighbor, of the entire moral system based on the alleviation of suffering, runs contrary to the very foundation of almost every ethical tradition the world has ever known. His praise for the noble, the hard, and the strong, and his contempt for the weak and the herd, seems, on its face, to be a justification for cruelty, an aristocratic worldview that has no place for the immense value that a utilitarian or a Christian would place on the well-being of the common person. Third, his philosophy is explicitly and unapologetically elitist. He has nothing but scorn for the democratic ideals of equality and universal rights. His entire project is aimed at the creation of a higher man, a noble, solitary overman, who will stand above the pathetic, comfort-seeking mediocrity of the masses. His vision is not a political program for the betterment of all. It is a spiritual project for the exceptional few. A goal that seems to justify, and even require, the suffering and the sacrifice of the great herd of humanity below. And finally, he is dangerous because of his very style. He did not write in the careful, systematic, and logical manner of a Kant. He wrote in aphorisms, in parables, in poems. His work is a brilliant, dazzling, and often contradictory tapestry of insights, provocations, and declarations. This poetic ambiguity is part of what makes him so powerful, but it is also what makes him so susceptible to gross and often malicious misinterpretation. His words can be cherry-picked, his ideas can be twisted, and his name can be attached to causes that he himself would have found utterly contemptible. A critical examination of Nietzsche, then, is a profoundly useful, even necessary project. His philosophy, if misunderstood or applied recklessly, has the potential to cause immense social harm, to justify forms of elitism and cruelty that would lead to a catastrophic decrease in human well-being. To handle a thinker who calls himself dynamite requires the utmost care, a responsible engagement that seeks not just to understand his ideas, but to grapple with their risks, to mitigate their potential for destruction while still learning from their profound and challenging insights. In this series, we will attempt to do just that. We will separate the man from the monstrous myth that was created by his sister and embraced by the fascists of the 20th century. We will take his great central concepts, the will to power, the overman, and the eternal recurrence, and we will subject them to a rigorous critique, examining their internal coherence and their moral implications. And we will bring his thought into a dialogue with the other great thinkers who have wrestled with his legacy, from his contemporaries to his modern-day critics. Nietzsche is an unavoidable thinker. His diagnosis of the modern condition, of the death of God and the rise of nihilism was so accurate that we are all, in a sense, living in the world that he prophesied. His great questions are our questions, and we cannot simply ignore them, but his answers, as we shall see, are a form of philosophical explosive. They have the power to clear away the rotten, life-denying structures of the past. But they also have the power to destroy everything, leaving only a crater where a civilization once stood. This series is an attempt to handle that dynamite with the critical respect that it deserves. It is an effort to understand the full, terrifying power of one of history's greatest minds, without being consumed by the blast. It is a journey into the heart of a philosophy that is at once the most dangerous and perhaps the most necessary of the modern age. Before we can even begin to philosophize with our hammer, before we can tap on the great idols of Nietzsche's thought, we must first confront the monstrous shadow that has hung over his name for more than a century. For many people, the name Nietzsche is inextricably linked with the horrors of Nazism. His ideas of the overman, the will to power, and the blonde beast seem to be a direct prelude to the master race ideology of the Third Reich. This association is the single greatest obstacle to any honest understanding of his work. And it is an association that is not an accident, but the result of a deliberate, malicious, and tragically successful campaign of intellectual forgery. This is a story of a great betrayal. A story of a sister who, out of a mixture of misguided love, profound incomprehension, and shameless opportunism, took her brother's brilliant, dangerous, and deeply nuanced legacy and twisted it into a crude, brutal, and politically convenient cudgel. To understand Nietzsche, we must first understand, and then exorcise, the ghost of his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, for she is the one who created the monstrous caricature that the world would come to know. Elisabeth and her brother Friedrich were, in almost every conceivable way, polar opposites. Where Nietzsche was a radical, solitary, and European thinker who despised nationalism and the modern state, Elisabeth was a conventional, social-climbing, and ardent German nationalist, and most importantly, where Nietzsche was a fierce and uncompromising opponent of the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Germany. Elisabeth was a committed and vocal anti-Semite. She married a prominent and fanatical anti-Semitic agitator, Bernhard Förster, a man whom Nietzsche openly despised. Their worldviews were so fundamentally incompatible that Nietzsche, in a fit of furious disgust, broke off contact with her for several years. In his letters, he raged against the anti-Semitic screamers, and he told his sister that her association with this hateful movement filled him with contempt. This is not a minor biographical detail, it is the crucial starting point. The philosophy of the brother and the politics of the sister were not just different, they were sworn and mortal enemies. But fate, in its cruel and ironic way, would give the sister the final word. In January of 1889, in the streets of Turin, Italy, Nietzsche collapsed, his brilliant mind finally succumbing to the syphilis he had likely contracted as a young man. He would spend the last 11 years of his life in a state of profound, near-vegetative mental darkness, unable to write, unable to speak, a silent, tragic ruin of a man. It was at this moment, with her brother rendered helpless, that Elisabeth made her move. She returned to Germany and took complete control of her incapacitated brother. And most importantly, she took control of his entire literary estate, the vast, chaotic, and priceless collection of his unpublished notebooks. She established the Nietzsche Archive in the city of Weimar, and she began the ambitious project of positioning herself as the sole, authoritative interpreter of her brother's work. She was not a philosopher. She did not understand the profound, subtle, and often contradictory nature of his thought. But she was a brilliant and ruthless marketer, and she had a clear, simple, and deeply political agenda. She wanted to transform her radical, anti-German, and anti-nationalist brother into a great patriotic prophet of a new and powerful German Reich. Her greatest and most criminal act of forgery was the creation of a book that Nietzsche himself never wrote. The Will to Power. In his final lucid years, Nietzsche had contemplated writing a great systematic work with this title, but he had explicitly and definitively abandoned the project. Elisabeth, however, knew that the world wanted a single definitive main work from her brother. And so, after his death, she decided to create one for him. She waded into his vast and chaotic collection of unpublished notes from his final, most productive, but also most unstable years. She cut, she pasted, she reordered, and in some cases, she deliberately suppressed or altered his words. She took fragments, aphorisms, and half-formed thoughts, stripped them of their context, and arranged them into a seemingly coherent system that reflected not her brother's philosophy, but her own crude nationalistic and anti-Semitic worldview. The book she published under the title The Will to Power is not Nietzsche's final masterpiece. It is Elisabeth's political manifesto, a grotesque and distorted caricature of her brother's thought. The consequences of this forgery were catastrophic, not just for philosophy, but for the world in her old age. Elisabeth became an ardent and vocal supporter of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. She saw in their movement the glorious, powerful new Germany she had always dreamed of, and in her brother's forged philosophy, she provided them with a veneer of intellectual respectability. In 1934, in a now infamous photograph, Hitler made a pilgrimage to the Nietzsche archive, where he was welcomed by Elisabeth. He stood, looking with faux reverence at a bust of the philosopher, a cane in his hand that had once belonged to Nietzsche, a gift from his admiring sister. The Nazis, with Elisabeth's active and enthusiastic help, took this forged, distorted, and simplified version of Nietzsche and made him their unofficial house philosopher. They took his complex idea of the Übermensch and twisted it into the racist ideology of the Aryan master race. They took his subtle, psychological concept of the will to power and turned it into a crude justification for military conquest and brutal domination. They took his criticism of Judeo-Christian morality and transformed it into a justification for their own monstrous and genocidal anti-Semitism. From a utilitarian perspective, Elisabeth's actions represent a case study in intellectual malpractice, with the most devastating consequences imaginable. Her personal and politically motivated distortion of her brother's work provided a philosophical fig leaf for an ideology that would unleash an unprecedented wave of suffering and death upon the world. The decades of scholarly work that were later required to untangle her forgery, led by figures like Walter Kaufmann, was not just an academic exercise, it was a necessary moral and historical project, an attempt to reclaim a great thinker from the clutches of his monstrous interpreters. And so, before we can even begin our own critique of the real Friedrich Nietzsche, we must perform this necessary exorcism. We must completely and totally separate the brother from the sister, the philosopher from the fascists who claimed him. We must recognize that Nietzsche's actual philosophy was profoundly individualistic, anti-political, anti-nationalist, and most importantly, fiercely and consistently anti-Semitic. His contempt for the German Reich and for the anti-Semitic screamers of his day is one of the most consistent themes in his entire body of work. This does not mean that his philosophy is without its own profound and deeply troubling dangers, which we will spend the rest of this series exploring, but those dangers are his own. They are the dangers of a radical, aristocratic, and often cruel individualism. They are not the dangers of a race nationalist and collectivist herd ideology. We have now, hopefully, cleared the ground. We have exorcised the Nazi ghost from the machine of Nietzsche's thought. And now, and only now, can we begin to critique the real, the authentic, and the infinitely more complex Friedrich Nietzsche. Having cleared away the monstrous ideological shadow of his sister and her fascist admirers, we can now begin to approach the real Friedrich Nietzsche. But the moment we do, we are confronted with a new and profound problem. How does one even begin to grapple with a philosopher who seems to despise the very act of systematic philosophy, who writes not in careful, logical arguments, but in dazzling, contradictory, and often infuriating fragments before we can critique the substance of his thought. We must first confront the deep and challenging problem of his style. The great tradition of German philosophy, especially in the wake of a figure like Immanuel Kant, was a tradition of system building, of constructing vast, intricate, and logically coherent cathedrals of thought, designed to explain the whole of reality. Nietzsche looked upon these great systems with a profound and unwavering suspicion. "I mistrust all systematizers, and I avoid them." He famously wrote, "The will to a system is a lack of integrity." For him, any attempt to capture the wild, chaotic, and endlessly fluid nature of life in a rigid, logical system was an act of intellectual dishonesty. Life, he believed, is a tangled mass of contradictions, of beautiful truths and terrible lies, of noble impulses and base desires, and any philosophical system that tries to smooth over these contradictions, to fit them into a neat, logical box, is a lie. It is a sign of a weak and fearful mind, a mind that cannot bear the full, tragic, and chaotic truth of existence, and so he rejected the system in favor of a different, more dangerous, and more artistic form of thought, the aphorism. His books are not linear arguments. They are collections of short, provocative, and often poetic fragments, flashes of lightning that illuminate a vast landscape for a brilliant, terrifying moment, and then leave you in the dark again. This style is a deliberate choice. It is a tool designed not to give you answers, but to force you to ask your own questions. It does not present a finished doctrine to be passively consumed. It engages you in a difficult, uncomfortable, and deeply personal dialogue. It demands that you, the reader, become a philosopher in your own right. This method has an undeniable and intoxicating power. It is what makes reading Nietzsche feel less like studying a philosophical text and more like being exposed to a high-voltage current of pure intellectual energy. But this same stylistic brilliance is also the source of the most profound and most persistent problems in his entire philosophy. The first and most obvious of these problems is the sheer number of contradictions in his work. He praises the pursuit of truth and then declares that truth is a lie. He celebrates the noble self-mastering individual and then declares that the self is a grammatical fiction. He writes with a profound psychological depth and then warns us that all psychology is a prejudice. This constant, almost gleeful, self-contradiction makes his true position on any given topic notoriously difficult and perhaps even impossible to pin down. It allows him to be all things to all people, a hero to the existentialists, an inspiration to the postmodernists, and, as we have seen, a prophet to the fascists. His refusal to build a system makes him the most malleable and therefore the most easily misinterpreted of all the great philosophers. From a utilitarian perspective, this style is a profound social liability. While its ambiguity might inspire a few strong individuals to achieve a higher state of being, its very lack of clarity is what allows it to be so easily weaponized. A philosophy that can be twisted to justify ideologies that cause immense, widespread suffering has a dangerously high potential for negative utility. The lack of a clear, systematic ethical framework makes his work a poor guide for building a stable, just, and cooperative society. A society that must run on a shared understanding of core principles, not on a series of brilliant but contradictory flashes of insight. This leads to the second major critique of his style, his refusal to engage in traditional philosophical argumentation. He does not, for the most part, lay out his premises and then logically deduce his conclusions in the manner of a Kant or a Spinoza. Instead, he makes grand, sweeping, and often shocking declarations. He presents his insights as self-evident truths that he has discovered through his own courageous and unflinching psychological introspection. He does not try to convince you with logic. He tries to seduce, to shock, and to overwhelm you with the artistic force of his vision. This can be seen as a form of profound intellectual arrogance, a refusal to do the hard democratic work of providing reasons for one's beliefs. It places him in the role not of a fellow seeker of truth, but of a prophet, a seer, a man who has looked into the abyss and has returned with a truth that is beyond mere logic. This is why many in the more analytical tradition of philosophy have been tempted to dismiss him, not as a true philosopher, but as a kind of literary artist, a poet, a cultural critic, a psychologist, but not, in the strict sense, a philosopher. And perhaps this is the most charitable and most accurate way to see him. His goal was not to create a logically sound and coherent system that could be proven true or false. His goal was to change his readers' perspective, to alter their values, to make them feel the world in a different way. He uses different masks, different personas, from the prophetic Zarathustra to the furious madman, not to build a single consistent argument, but to explore a single complex problem from a variety of different artistic and emotional angles. So we are left with a difficult and perhaps unanswerable question. Is Nietzsche's anti-philosophical style a brilliant and necessary feature of his life-affirming project, or is it a fatal and irresponsible flaw that makes his work ultimately unreliable and dangerous? The answer, most likely, is that it is both. His refusal to build a system is the very source of his explosive, liberating, and creative power. It is what allows him to ask the questions that the more cautious, systematic thinkers could not. But it is also the very thing that has allowed his philosophical dynamite to fall into the wrong hands time and time again, leaving a trail of destruction and misunderstanding that continues to this day. The critique of his style is the necessary first step in any honest engagement with his work, because it forces us to be humble, to be cautious, and to constantly ask ourselves, what did this brilliant, dangerous, and deeply contradictory man really mean? And how can we ever be truly sure we have understood him at all? No honest and intellectually serious critique of Friedrich Nietzsche can avoid a direct confrontation with the most troubling, most persistent, and most indefensible aspect of his entire body of work. His profound and often vicious misogyny. It is an element of his thought that cannot be easily dismissed as a minor flaw or a product of his time. For it is woven deeply into the fabric of his philosophy, a dark, ugly, and ultimately self-contradictory thread that threatens to unravel the very integrity of his entire project. It is a poison that must be drawn out and examined in the full light of day. The most famous and most infamous of these statements, the one that has been quoted endlessly to condemn him, comes from his great prophetic work. Thus spoke Zarathustra. An old woman, giving advice to the prophet, concludes with the chilling line, "You are going to women. Do not forget the whip." It is a phrase of such shocking, almost cartoonish cruelty that many have tried to explain it away, to soften its blow, but it does not stand alone. It is merely the most memorable peak in a vast mountain range of contemptuous, dismissive, and often hateful statements about women. Throughout his work, he consistently portrays women not as individuals, but as a strange and alien species. Fundamentally different from men, and almost always for the worse, he describes woman as a creature of the surface, all appearance, shimmer, and shallow foolishness. He claims that her natural role is for recreation and procreation, a pleasant diversion for the male warrior or philosopher, but not a true companion. He famously wrote that man's happiness is a statement that denies women any independent agency or will of their own. He was particularly scornful of the movement for women's emancipation in his own time. He saw the educated, emancipated woman as a pathetic and unnatural creature, a failed attempt to be like a man, which in his view only resulted in her losing her natural feminine qualities without gaining any masculine strength. He believed that the ultimate goal of a woman was to give birth to the overman. But he seemed to have no conception that a woman herself could ever aspire to become such a being. Her role was to be the fertile soil, not the magnificent plant that grows from it. Now, some defenders of Nietzsche have tried to explain away these statements. The first line of defense is that his language is often metaphorical. They argue that when Zarathustra's old woman speaks of the whip, she is not talking about literal violence, but about a kind of psychological toughness, a refusal to be sentimental, and that woman herself is often a metaphor for life or for truth. Those elusive, beautiful, and often deceptive concepts that the philosopher must master with a firm and unsentimental hand. But this defense, while partially true, is ultimately unsatisfying. While Nietzsche certainly does use woman as a metaphor, many of his statements are clearly and unambiguously about actual living women. The metaphorical reading does not excuse the literal ugly prejudice that is so clearly on display. The metaphor itself is built on a foundation of deeply misogynistic assumptions about the nature of the feminine. It does not solve the problem. It simply displaces it onto a more abstract but no less problematic level. A more profound and more damning critique comes from the great feminist existentialist Simone de Beauvoir. In her landmark book, The Second Sex, she developed the concept of woman as the other. She argued that throughout history, man has defined himself as the absolute essential subject, and he has defined woman as the inessential other, a being who is understood only in relation to him. She is the mother, the wife, the muse, the distraction. But she is never, in herself, the protagonist of her own story, and Nietzsche's philosophy is a perfect and tragic example of this. His entire worldview is constructed from an exclusively male perspective. The great struggle he describes, the struggle to overcome nihilism and become the overman, is framed as a fundamentally masculine project. Women, in his world, are relegated to the role of either obstacles or tools in this great male drama. They are the dangerous, cat-like creatures who might distract the philosopher from his work. Or they are the passive, beautiful vessels whose purpose is to relax the warrior and to give birth to his heroic sons. They are never ever seen as fellow warriors, as fellow creators, as potential overmen in their own right. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a catastrophic failure of his philosophy. A worldview that effectively dismisses the intellectual, creative, and spiritual potential of half the human race is a worldview that actively works against the goal of maximizing human flourishing. It is a philosophy that, if put into practice, would create a society that systematically denies opportunity and dignity to women, leading to an immeasurable loss of potential happiness, creativity, and progress for everyone. It is a system that is fundamentally unjust, and therefore cannot possibly produce the best and happiest world. And this leads us to the most profound and most damaging critique of all: the deep internal contradiction within Nietzsche's own thought. How can a philosopher who so passionately champions the solitary, sovereign individual, the person who creates their own values and lives by their own law, then turn around and deny that very potential to an entire gender? How can the great enemy of herd morality and lazy generalizations resort to the most simplistic and most prejudiced herd thinking when it comes to the subject of women? His misogyny is a profound betrayal of his own most cherished principles. It reveals a deep and incurable blind spot at the very heart of his philosophy. It shows that for all his talk of overcoming the prejudices of his time, he himself was still a prisoner of them. It shows that the great psychologist, the man who so brilliantly dissected the souls of others, was unable, or perhaps unwilling, to fully dissect his own. His views on women are the ugly, unphilosophical residue of his own bitter personal experiences, of his failed relationships, and of the unexamined, patriarchal assumptions of the world he lived in. To read Nietzsche responsibly in the 21st century, then, requires us to confront this aspect of his thought head-on. We cannot ignore it, we cannot excuse it, and we cannot explain it away with clever metaphorical interpretations. We must acknowledge it as a profound and a damaging failure, a place where his philosophy collapses into simple, ugly prejudice. We can, and we must, still learn from his powerful critiques of morality, his profound psychological insights, and his exhilarating call for a life of creative self-overcoming. But we must do so with the full and clear understanding that the tools he offers us were forged in a workshop that explicitly excluded women from being seen as fellow artists, as fellow creators, and as fellow human beings. The great philosopher of the future, the man who claimed to be writing for a new kind of soul, was, in this one crucial respect, tragically and hopelessly trapped in the very worst prejudices of the past. Having confronted the deeply personal and often troubling aspects of Nietzsche's own style and character, we now turn to the first of our great philosophical critics. A man who represents a completely different world of thought, a man who was a champion of logic, of science, of Enlightenment reason, and of a compassionate, liberal humanism. This is the great British philosopher, Bertrand Russell, and his famous critique of Nietzsche is a clash of two titans, a battle between two of the most fundamental and opposing temperaments in the history of ideas. Russell's critique, found most famously in his monumental A History of Western Philosophy, is not a simple disagreement. It is a profound and almost total rejection of Nietzsche's entire project. He looks at Nietzsche's work and sees not a profound new philosophy, but the ultimate and most dangerous expression of a certain kind of Byronic romantic egoism. He argues that Nietzsche's philosophy is not the result of a careful, logical analysis of the world, but is instead a direct and almost childish manifestation of his own personal frustrations and desires. Nietzsche, Russell points out, was a man who was, in his own life, sickly, solitary, and almost completely ignored by the academic and cultural world of his time, and so, Russell argues, he created a philosophy that is a form of heroic wish fulfillment. A fantasy of power, he dreamed up a world that glorified the very things he lacked. Immense strength, profound solitude, and a world historical importance. His philosophy, for Russell, is not a map of reality. It is a psychological projection, the beautiful and dangerous daydream of a brilliant but deeply unhappy man. He directs his most scathing criticism at the very heart of Nietzsche's positive project, the ideal of the Übermensch, or the Overman. Russell sees this figure not as a noble goal for humanity, but as a deeply dangerous and ultimately juvenile fantasy. He compares the Overman to the great swaggering heroes of epic poems and to the conquering tyrants of history, figures like Napoleon or Alexander the Great, men who, in their pursuit of personal glory, inflicted an almost unimaginable amount of suffering upon the world. They are not models for a better future. They are relics of a barbaric past. A world populated by such heroes, each one striving to assert their own will to power, each one seeing themselves as the creator of their own values, would not be a world of beautiful, creative flourishing. It would be a world of endless, brutal, and completely destructive conflict, a war of all against all, an anarchy of competing egos. It is a vision, Russell suggests, that could only be admired by someone who has never had any real practical experience of political power or the terrible, real-world consequences of unrestrained ambition. Russell also attacks the very foundation of Nietzsche's system, the concept of the will to power itself. He dismisses it as a vast and unscientific generalization. He acknowledges that a desire for power is certainly one of the great motivating forces of human life, but he argues that it is far from the only one. Human beings are also motivated by a desire for pleasure, by a need for comfort and security, by love, by compassion, and sometimes, he dryly notes, by simple boredom and a desire for excitement. To take all the rich, complex, and often contradictory motivations of the human heart and to reduce them all to a single metaphysical drive for power is, for Russell, a profound and deeply unphilosophical oversimplification. It ignores the vast and varied landscape of human psychology in favor of a single monolithic and ultimately unprovable dogma. It is a poet's metaphor, not a philosopher's serious analysis of human nature, a critique that resonates from a utilitarian viewpoint, as it ignores the most important human motivation of all, the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain. The very heart of Russell's critique is a fundamentally utilitarian one. He is a philosopher who is deeply concerned with the real-world consequences of ideas, with their effect on the overall happiness and well-being of society, and when he looks at Nietzsche's philosophy, he sees a recipe for a catastrophic decrease in human happiness. Nietzsche's praise of suffering, his contempt for compassion and pity, his aristocratic disdain for the herd, and his celebration of the solitary, powerful individual is for Russell a direct and unambiguous formula for a world that would maximize misery for the vast majority of people. Nietzsche's ideal of greatness is one that is purchased at the cost of immense human suffering, a price that no rational, compassionate, or socially minded person would ever be willing to pay. His philosophy is a form of cosmic impiety, a dangerous and self-indulgent fantasy that is fundamentally incompatible with the difficult, practical, and necessary project of building a just, stable, and happy society for all. It is a philosophy that glorifies the beautiful, predatory hawk while completely ignoring the immense suffering of the thousands of chickens it preys upon. It is important to note, however, that Russell's critique is not a complete and total dismissal. He was too intellectually honest for that. He openly acknowledges Nietzsche's brilliant, aphoristic style, his profound psychological insights, and the power of his critique of the hypocrisy and life-denying aspects of traditional Christian morality. He understands the appeal of Nietzsche's philosophy. He sees it as a necessary and powerful medicine against a certain kind of meekness, conformity, and cant that was prevalent in the 19th century. But in the end, he concludes that the medicine is far more poisonous than the disease it was intended to cure. He sees Nietzsche as a brilliant artist, a profound cultural critic, and a psychologist of the first rank, but as a philosopher in the strict sense of a seeker of logical, objective truth. He sees him as a deeply flawed and ultimately dangerous failure. His work is a symptom of a sick and disordered age, not a cure for it. Russell's final verdict, then, is that Nietzsche's philosophy is ultimately a form of solipsistic fantasy, a worldview that is fundamentally unlivable on a societal scale. It is a morality for a solitary romantic hero, a lonely artist, a conquering tyrant, but it is not a morality for a community of human beings. It is a beautiful, powerful, and deeply seductive dream that, if ever put into practice, would inevitably awaken into a nightmare of suffering, violence, and chaos. It is the voice of reason, of science, and of a compassionate democratic humanism, standing in direct and unwavering opposition to Nietzsche's dangerous and beautiful aristocratic dream. We have now seen how Bertrand Russell, from the tradition of analytic philosophy, critiqued Nietzsche as a dangerous and irrational romantic, but we now turn to a different, and perhaps even more profound critique, one that comes from the heart of the great continental tradition of German thought. This is the critique leveled by one of the most influential living philosophers, Jürgen Habermas, a man who has spent his entire career defending the very project that Nietzsche sought to destroy, the project of the Enlightenment. Habermas is the great modern champion of reason, of dialogue, and of the possibility of a just and democratic society built on a foundation of rational consensus. He looks at Nietzsche not as a romantic poet, but as the most brilliant and most dangerous of all the counter-Enlightenment thinkers. He takes Nietzsche's radical skepticism seriously, and in doing so, he uncovers what he believes to be a fatal and ultimately self-refuting flaw at the very heart of Nietzsche's entire project. The core of Habermas's critique is the concept of a performative contradiction. To understand this, we must first remember the core of Nietzsche's radical position on truth. As we have seen, Nietzsche argues that there is no such thing as objective truth. There are only perspectives, only interpretations, and every claim to truth, he insists, is nothing more than a disguised manifestation of the will to power. A philosopher who claims to have found the truth is really just trying to impose his own will, his own values, on the rest of the world. This is a powerful and deeply unsettling critique. It unmasks the hidden motives behind all claims to knowledge. But Habermas then turns this same critical weapon back upon Nietzsche himself, and he asks a simple but devastating question. If all claims to truth are merely expressions of a will to power, then on what grounds should we believe that Nietzsche's own philosophy is true? If Nietzsche's statement that there is no truth is itself true, then the statement itself must not be true. It is a snake that eats its own tail. This is the performative contradiction, the very act of making the philosophical claim. The act of writing a book and presenting it to the world as a true account of reality fundamentally contradicts the content of the claim, which is that no such true accounts are possible. Nietzsche, the great unmasker, cannot escape having his own mask torn off. He is still playing the game of reason. He is still making truth claims, even as he is trying to argue that the entire game is a fraud. He is sawing off the very branch upon which he himself is sitting. For Habermas, this is not just a clever logical trick. It points to a much deeper truth about the nature of reason itself. He argues that Nietzsche makes a fundamental mistake. He sees reason only in one of its forms, as a tool for domination, as an instrumental reason that the solitary subject uses to master and to control the world. This is reason as an expression of the will to power, but Habermas insists that this is only one, and not even the most important form of reason. The true and more fundamental form of reason, Habermas argues, is communicative rationality. He points out that the moment we open our mouths to speak to another person, the moment we try to convince them of something, we are implicitly entering into a rational agreement. We are assuming that there is a shared ground of understanding, that we can give reasons for our beliefs, and that we can in the end be persuaded not by force or by trickery, but by the unforced force of the better argument. This potential for reaching a consensus through free and open dialogue is, for Habermas, the very foundation of reason. From a utilitarian perspective, this communicative reason is the most valuable tool that humanity possesses. It is the basis for all social cooperation, for all democratic lawmaking, and for all scientific progress. It is the mechanism by which we can solve our shared problems and work together to create a society that maximizes well-being for everyone. Nietzsche's philosophy, by denying the very possibility of a truth that is not just a power play, is a direct assault on this crucial social resource. It is a philosophy that, if taken seriously, makes a just and cooperative society impossible. A world governed by Nietzsche's principles would not be a world of creative overmen. It would be a world where the only thing left is a raw and brutal struggle for power. A world where the loudest, most powerful, and most persuasive voice wins, not the most reasonable one. It is a recipe for a state of perpetual conflict, a world of immense and unavoidable suffering, a world of catastrophic disutility. Habermas's entire project is an attempt to defend the rational tools we need to save ourselves from this fate. Habermas, however, is a subtle enough thinker to not just dismiss Nietzsche entirely. He sees him as a crucial and necessary dark writer of the Enlightenment, a thinker who brilliantly and correctly exposed the dangers of a purely instrumental reason, a reason that had become a mere tool for the domination of nature and of other human beings. Nietzsche correctly saw that this form of reason, instead of liberating humanity, was creating new and more sophisticated forms of control. But Nietzsche's great mistake, in Habermas's view, was to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In his correct and powerful critique of instrumental reason, he incorrectly and tragically abandoned the very possibility of communicative reason altogether. He saw only the monologue of the solitary, power-seeking will, and he was blind to the possibility of the dialogue between two subjects who were seeking mutual understanding. He saw that one form of reason had become a poison, and he concluded that all reason must be poison. And so, we are left with a profound conflict between two competing and fundamentally incompatible visions of the world. For Nietzsche, the ultimate reality is the struggle of individual wills, and truth is just a weapon in that struggle. For Habermas, the ultimate potential of humanity lies in our ability to transcend that struggle, to submit our private wills to the shared, rational process of open and honest communication. It is a choice between a world of solitary, creative, and ultimately tragic heroes, and a world of a messy, difficult, ultimately hopeful democratic community. Habermas's critique is a powerful defense of the Enlightenment dream, a dream that our shared reason, despite all its flaws and all its dangers, is still the last and best hope for humanity. He looks at Nietzsche's brilliant, beautiful, and terrifying philosophy, and he sees not a path to a higher form of being, but a seductive and ultimately self-refuting dead end. A final, brilliant flash of a mind that has chosen to burn down the entire house of reason without realizing that it is still trapped inside. Long before Friedrich Nietzsche ever picked up his philosophical hammer, another great psychologist of the soul had already stared into the same abyss, had wrestled with the same demons, and had, in his own way, foreseen the terrible consequences of a world where everything is permitted. This was the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, a writer whom Nietzsche himself would later discover and praise as the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn, and his great novels, written decades before Nietzsche's major works, serve as the most profound, powerful, and prophetic critique of the very ideas that Nietzsche would one day champion. If Nietzsche was the great theorist of the Overman, then Dostoevsky was the great tragic chronicler of what happens when real, flawed, and deeply human men attempt to become such a being. His novels are the laboratories, the great, bloody, and psychologically devastating thought experiments where the high-minded theories of the nihilist are put to the ultimate test, and the results are a terrifying and unambiguous warning. He is the great what-if, the storyteller who shows us the human cost of these dangerous and seductive ideas. His first, and most famous, test case is Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. Here is a man who is a perfect, proto-Nietzschean hero. He is a proud, solitary intellectual who has developed his own extraordinary man theory, a theory that divides the world into the common herd and the great Napoleonic figures who have an inner right to transgress, to create their own values. This is, in essence, a blueprint for the Overman, a man who seeks to live beyond good and evil. But Dostoevsky's great psychological critique is to show that Raskolnikov cannot bear the weight of his own freedom. The moment he puts his theory into practice, his own human nature, the very slave morality of compassion, of guilt, and of love, that his theory so despised, rises up and wages a terrible war against him from the inside. He is consumed by fever, by paranoia, and by an overwhelming need to reconnect with the very humanity he had tried to place himself above. He discovers that his conscience is not a social construct. He can simply cast aside, but is a fundamental and inescapable part of his own soul. From a utilitarian perspective, Raskolnikov's experiment is a catastrophic failure. His single, transcendent act produces an immense and cascading wave of suffering. It brings misery to his victims, to his own family, and most of all, to himself. He is a living testament to the profound disutility of a philosophy that places the abstract right of a single extraordinary individual above the concrete well-being of the community. Dostoevsky shows, with a brutal clarity, that the path of the overman, when attempted by a real human being, leads not to a higher state of being, but to a personal and social hell. If Raskolnikov is the individual test case, then Dostoevsky's great novel, The Possessed, is the social one. This is Dostoevsky's vision of what happens when an entire group of intellectuals becomes possessed by Nietzschean ideas. The revolutionaries in the novel, led by the cynical Pyotr Verkovensky, are all driven by a will to power. They seek to perform a revaluation of all values, to tear down the old world and to build a new one based on their own superior intellect. They are a collective of would-be overmen, and the result is not a new, higher form of society, but a descent into a hell of chaos, of terror, of manipulation, and of meaningless destruction. The society they create is not one that maximizes human flourishing, but one that maximizes human misery. Dostoevsky's novel is a powerful, prophetic warning that a world governed by the principles of the will to power, a world stripped of the slave virtues of compassion and humility, would not be a creative paradise for the strong. It would be a squalid, bloody, and ultimately self-consuming tyranny. Even the great rebels of his final masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, can be seen as a critique of the Nietzschean ideal. Ivan Karamazov is a man who possesses an intellect as powerful and as rebellious as Nietzsche's own. His great rebellion against God, his rejection of a world filled with suffering, is a position of profound intellectual integrity, but his philosophy of everything is permitted does not lead to his own elevation. It leads to the sordid elimination of his father by his vulgar double Smerdyak and to his own descent into madness. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche start from the same, terrifying place. They both look unflinchingly at the chaos, the irrationality and the darkness of the human soul, the place Dostoevsky called the underground. They both understand that human beings are not the gentle, rational creatures of the Enlightenment's naive dreams, but are proud, passionate, and often self-destructive beings. But from this same starting point, they travel in two completely opposite directions. For Nietzsche, this dark, chaotic energy, this will to power, is the source of all life and all creativity. It is a force to be embraced, to be affirmed, to be shaped by the great artist, the overman, into a new and more beautiful form. The solution is to find a strength within the self that is great enough to overcome the abyss, to become your own God, to be the sole and absolute creator of your own values. His is a philosophy of heroic and ultimately solitary self-affirmation. But for Dostoevsky, this same dark energy, this Karamazov nature, is the source of our sin, our alienation, and our suffering. It is not a force to be embraced, but a force to be overcome. But it cannot be overcome by the self alone. The proud, isolated individual, no matter how strong, is doomed to be consumed by it. The only solution, for Dostoevsky, is to be found in a force outside of the self, in the irrational, illogical, and profoundly un-Nietzschean act of faith, in the humble acceptance of grace, and in the selfless, Christ-like love embodied by characters like Sonia and Alyosha. Dostoevsky's final, unspoken word to Nietzsche is a profound and a tragic one. He would look at the overman and see not a new savior, but an old demon, the demon of pride, the very same sin that led his own great characters to their ruin. He would argue that any attempt to create a new world without a foundation in selfless, compassionate love is doomed to recreate the oldest and most terrible forms of tyranny and despair. For the will to power, when it is unchecked by a love that comes from beyond the self, is simply another, more philosophical, name for the devil. After being claimed by the fascists, dismissed by the logicians, and wrestled with by the Dostoevskians, the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche would find its most enthusiastic and most complicated reception in the latter half of the 20th century, among the group of thinkers who would come to be known as the postmodernists. In Nietzsche, they found their great predecessor, the man who had first dared to announce the death of God, to declare the end of objective truth, and to take a hammer to the entire Western philosophical tradition. He was, in a very real sense, the grandfather of their entire project. The postmodern thinkers took Nietzsche's most radical ideas and made them their own. His declaration that there are no facts, only interpretations, became the cornerstone of their own deep skepticism towards objective reality. His method of genealogy, of unmasking the hidden historic and often ugly motives behind our most cherished moral values, became the primary tool of their own cultural and social critiques. They were his greatest and most faithful disciples, and they used his philosophical dynamite to joyfully deconstruct the remaining pillars of modern thought. The French philosopher Michel Foucault, for example, took Nietzsche's concept of the will to power and transformed it from a metaphysical principle into a concrete tool for analyzing society. Foucault's great project was to show how institutions, like prisons, hospitals, and schools, use systems of power and knowledge to control and to discipline individuals. His genealogies of madness and punishment are a direct and brilliant application of the Nietzschean method, unmasking the truth as a tool of power, just as Nietzsche had done for morality. Another great French thinker, Jacques Derrida, took Nietzsche's perspectivism to its ultimate linguistic conclusion. With his method of deconstruction, Derrida argued that the entire Western philosophical tradition was built on a series of false oppositions: good versus evil, presence versus absence, truth versus fiction, and his work was a playful but rigorous attempt to show how these hierarchies are not natural, but are constructed by the very language we use. His attack on the idea of a stable final meaning in a text is a radicalization of Nietzsche's war on the true world. But here we arrive at the great and deeply ironic twist in this intellectual inheritance. A move we can call the postmodern two-step, for after using Nietzsche's own tools to dismantle the rest of the philosophical tradition, the postmodernists then, in a final critical move, turned that very same hammer back upon Nietzsche himself. They were his greatest disciples, but they were also his sharpest and most subtle critics. And their critique is a profound and a challenging one. They argued that Nietzsche, for all his radicalism, for all his talk of destroying the old idols, had in the end simply created new ones in their place. They saw that even as he was trying to escape the old metaphysical tradition, he was still, in many ways, a prisoner of its habit. And the first and most obvious of these new problematic idols was his great, heroic vision of the Übermensch, the Overman. From a postmodern perspective, with its incredulity toward meta-narratives, the Overman looks suspiciously like a new grand narrative. It is a single, heroic, and implicitly masculine ideal that threatens to become a new, oppressive standard for all of humanity. It is a new sun that threatens to chain the earth to its orbit, silencing all the other different and lesser ways of being. The postmodernists, with their focus on celebrating difference in the little narratives of marginalized people, were deeply suspicious of this single, aristocratic, and potentially tyrannical ideal. From a utilitarian viewpoint, this is a powerful critique: the elevation of a single, higher type of human. The Overman could be used to justify the neglect or even the oppression of the vast majority of people who do not fit this heroic mold. A society that celebrates a multiplicity of different life paths and values, a world of little narratives, is arguably one that is more likely to produce a greater overall well-being for a greater number of people than a world that is fixated on the creation of a few, and often suffering, great men. The postmodernists also turned their critical eye on Nietzsche's most fundamental concept, the will to power. They questioned whether this was not just another attempt to find a single, universal, and metaphysical explanation for everything, the very kind of first principle that Nietzsche himself had taught them to be suspicious of. Foucault, for example, was far more interested in the specific, local, and messy ways that power operates in a prison or a clinic than he was in a single and abstract will to power that is supposed to explain the entire universe. Even Nietzsche's most radical idea, his perspectivism, his claim that there is no truth, was subjected to this same critique. The postmodernists, especially Derrida, would argue that even as Nietzsche was trying to escape the prison of Western metaphysics, he was still using its language, its concepts, and its oppositions. He was a thinker who was trying to tear down the master's house, but the only tools he had to do so were the master's own. He was, in the end, still a part of the very tradition he was so desperately and so brilliantly trying to overcome. And so, the postmodern critique of Nietzsche is a deeply ironic and a complicated one. It is a critique born of a profound love and a deep intellectual debt. They saw him as the great liberator, the one who had freed them from the tyranny of truth, of God, and of morality. But they also saw him as the last great metaphysician, a man who, in the end, could not resist the temptation to create a new mythology, a new set of idols, a new grand narrative, in place of the old ones he had so joyfully smashed. They are his greatest disciples precisely because they learned his lesson so well, the lesson of perpetual skepticism, of a constant critical questioning of all claims to a final, absolute truth, and they honored him by being true to that lesson, by refusing to accept even his own great heroic concepts, the Overman and the will to power, as a new and final gospel. They took his hammer, and in a final act of loving, critical betrayal, they used it to tap on the feet of their own master. And they found that even he was not made of solid gold, but of a beautiful, brilliant, ultimately all too human clay. We have now examined Nietzsche through the eyes of the logician, the social theorist, and the feminist, but we now turn to the great and ultimate adversary against which he defined his entire life's work, the single institution that he called the one great curse, the one immortal blemish of mankind, Christianity. To understand the Christian critique of Nietzsche is to understand a battle, not just between two philosophies, but between two fundamentally opposed and utterly irreconcilable visions of the universe and of the human soul's place within it. From a Christian perspective, Nietzsche's entire vast and brilliant philosophy is a magnificent and a deeply tragic monument to the first, the oldest, and the most deadly of all the sins. The sin of pride. He is seen as the ultimate prodigal son, a soul of immense spiritual gifts, who took his inheritance of Western thought and squandered it in a far country of his own making. His philosophy is the ultimate expression of the primordial, Luciferian cry, "I will not, sir." It is the attempt to tear down the throne of God and to place the human will, in the form of the Overman, upon it. The will to power, from this viewpoint, is not a neutral metaphysical force. It is a philosophical name for the endless, selfish, and untamed striving of the ego. The very force that Christianity believes is the source of all our sin and all our suffering. It is the prideful, grasping nature of the fallen man, and Nietzsche's great error was not in identifying this force, but in celebrating it, in calling it the source of life instead of the source of death. Christianity does not deny the will to power. It simply calls it by its older, more accurate name, sin. The Christian critique then turns to Nietzsche's most ferocious and most central attack, his assault on the virtue of pity or compassion. Nietzsche saw pity as the great poison of slave morality, a life-denying emotion that preserves weakness, multiplies suffering, and holds back the development of the strong. He called for a hardness of heart, for a joyful acceptance of the suffering of others, as a necessary part of a grand and beautiful, if terrible, world. But for the Christian, this is not just an error, it is a form of spiritual monstrosity. For in the Christian worldview, compassion is not a weakness. It is the very image of God on earth. It is the central emotion that defines the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. It is the feeling that moves the Good Samaritan to help the wounded man by the side of the road. It is the feeling that leads Christ to heal the sick and to weep at the death of his friend. To reject pity is to reject the very heart of the Christian gospel. It is to turn one's back on the suffering of one's neighbor, and in doing so, to turn one's back on God himself. From a utilitarian perspective, the Christian defense of compassion is also a profound argument for social well-being. A society that cultivates the virtue of pity is one that builds hospitals, that cares for the poor, that protects the vulnerable, and that seeks to alleviate the suffering of all its members. It is a philosophy that, when practiced, leads to a massive increase in overall human happiness and a decrease in misery. Nietzsche's master morality, with its contempt for the weak, would, if put into practice, create a brutal, merciless society where the vast majority of people would live in a state of fear and neglect, a world of immense and unchecked suffering. The Christian critique would also find Nietzsche's great formula for life affirmation, amor fati, the love of one's fate, to be a profound moral failure, while Christianity also preaches a form of acceptance, of surrendering to God's wit. It does not call upon us to love the evil and the injustice in the world. It calls upon us to fight against it. It commands us to be a force for healing, for justice, and for reconciliation in a broken and a fallen world. Not to simply affirm that world's brokenness as a necessary part of a beautiful, tragic tapestry. To stand before the spectacle of a suffering child, as Ivan Karamazov did, and to love that fate, would be, for the Christian, a monstrous and an unforgivable sin. It is a quietistic acceptance of evil, a beautiful, poetic, but ultimately cowardly refusal to take up the difficult, practical, and active work of love, which is to struggle against the darkness, not to praise it for its role in the great drama of existence. Nietzsche, it is true, had a strange and almost admiring view of Jesus Christ himself. He saw him not as the Son of God, but as a kind of holy anarchist, a sublime spiritual idiot in the Dostoevskian sense, who lived and died by a radical inner truth. But he argued that the Church and St. Paul, in particular, had completely betrayed and corrupted this original message, turning a joyful, life-affirming wisdom into a resentful, life-denying religion of guilt and punishment. The Christian response would be that Nietzsche had created a false opposition, that he had fundamentally misunderstood both Christ and the Church. He saw the Christian message as a retreat from the world, a preparation for an otherworldly kingdom, but the great Christian tradition has always insisted that its mission is to bring the kingdom of God into this world, to transform this fallen reality through acts of love, of justice, and of self-sacrifice. Nietzsche's Jesus is a beautiful but ultimately solitary and tragic figure, a noble soul who is crushed by the world. And so, we arrive at the great unbridgeable chasm between these two worldviews. It is a choice between two fundamentally different and mutually exclusive visions of the human purpose. For Nietzsche, the goal of life is the creation of the powerful, solitary and self-legislating overman, a being who has overcome the herd and stands alone in his creative glory. For Christianity, the goal of life is the creation of the saint, a being who has overcome the self and lives in a state of humble, loving communion with God and with his neighbor. Nietzsche's philosophy is a celebration of pride. Christianity's is a celebration of humility. Nietzsche's great virtue is the will to power. Christianity's is the will to self-sacrificial love. Nietzsche's final destination is a state of joyful, tragic, and solitary self-affirmation. Christianity's is a state of joyful, loving, and communal self-surrender. The Christian critique, in the end, sees Nietzsche's entire brilliant, beautiful, and tragic philosophy as the story of the ultimate prodigal son. He is a soul of immense, almost divine spiritual gifts, who chose, in a final great act of prideful freedom, to turn his back on the love of the Father. He took his inheritance of Western thought and he journeyed into a far country, the country of the self, and there he built a magnificent, solitary, and ultimately empty palace. He is the great cautionary tale, the ultimate proof that the human heart, no matter how brilliant, no matter how strong, cannot live on its own will alone. For a world without a transcendent, self-giving love is, in the end, not a playground for the gods, but a cold, lonely, and starless night. Given Friedrich Nietzsche's ferocious and unrelenting assault on the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, and given the monstrous anti-Semitic caricature that was later made of him, one might expect the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century to be his most bitter and most unforgiving critics. But in one of the most surprising and most fruitful encounters in modern intellectual history, the opposite often proved to be true. Many Jewish philosophers looked at Nietzsche and saw not an enemy, but a strange and deeply misunderstood ally, a tragic prophet whose destructive work was a necessary, if painful, prelude to a new kind of faith. These thinkers were able to make a crucial distinction that many Christian critics could not. They were able to separate Nietzsche's furious attack on Christianity, which he saw as a life-denying slave morality, from a wholesale rejection of the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition. In fact, Nietzsche himself often held the Old Testament in high regard. He admired what he saw as its grand style, its honesty about human passion, and its powerful, world-affirming spirit. He contrasted the strong and often wrathful God of the ancient Hebrews favorably with what he saw as the weak, pity-drenched God of the New Testament. This created an opening, a space for a dialogue where Jewish thinkers could engage with Nietzsche not as an outright blasphemer, but as a profound, if deeply troubled, religious thinker, they were able to see past his identity as the Antichrist and to recognize in him a man who was engaged in a desperate and almost holy war against the dead. Inauthentic and purely conventional religiosity of his time, a struggle that they themselves understood with a profound and an intimate familiarity. The most powerful and most influential of these interpretations came from the great Jewish existentialist, Martin Buber. Buber looked at Nietzsche's famous and terrible proclamation, "God is dead," and he did not hear a cry of atheistic triumph. He heard a cry of profound, almost unbearable spiritual agony. He saw Nietzsche as a man with a deep and a genuine religious sensibility, a man who had searched for God with his entire being, and in finding only the empty, hollowed-out conventions of modern European Christianity, had declared the throne of heaven to be empty. Nietzsche, for Buber, was not a simple atheist. He was a prophet of the eclipse of God, a man who was living through the dark night of the soul of an entire civilization. His destructive work, his hammering of the idols, his war on the old dead morality, was a necessary and even a sacred act of purification. He was tearing down the false, comfortable, and ultimately idolatrous images of God that had kept humanity in a state of spiritual childhood. He was clearing the ground, Buber believed, for the possibility of a new, more direct, and more authentic encounter with the living God. From a utilitarian perspective, these thinkers found a strange and profound utility in Nietzsche's destructive project. By attacking the deadening, inauthentic forms of institutionalized religion, Nietzsche's philosophy, paradoxically, could serve as a catalyst for a healthier, more robust, and more meaningful form of spiritual well-being. He forced believers to move beyond a simple, inherited dogma and to forge a more personal, more courageous, and ultimately more satisfying relationship with the divine. His poison was, in a strange way, the necessary medicine for a sick and dying faith. But while these Jewish thinkers could often embrace Nietzsche the critic, they fundamentally and absolutely rejected Nietzsche the creator. They saw the profound truth in his diagnosis, but they saw a profound and a dangerous error in his proposed cure. The great ideal of the overman, the solitary heroic individual who creates his own values and becomes his own God, is a concept that is deeply and fundamentally alien to the entire Jewish theological and cultural tradition. The central and most important event in the Jewish worldview is not the creation of the self, but the encounter with the other, the relationship, the dialogue. Buber's great philosophy is built around the distinction between the I-it relationship, where we treat others as objects, and the sacred I-thou relationship, where we enter into a direct, unmediated, and holy dialogue with another being. Whether that being is another person or God himself, life finds its meaning not in the monologue of the self, but in the dialogue of the community. Nietzsche's overman is a figure of profound and tragic solitude. He is a monologist, a being who stands alone, legislating his own law for a world that exists only as material for his own creative will. The entire Jewish tradition, on the other hand, is built on the idea of the covenant of the community, of a people bound together in a shared relationship with God and with each other. Salvation is not a personal project of self-overcoming. It is a communal project of collective responsibility and mutual love. And so, the Jewish critique of Nietzsche is a profound yes and a profound no. It is a yes to his courage, to his honesty, to his brilliant and necessary unmasking of the false idols of a deadened, hypocritical, and spiritually empty modern world. It is a yes to the prophet, who dared to announce that the old ways of speaking about God were no longer believable, a truth that any honest believer must confront. It is a yes to the man who was so filled with a longing for the sacred that he could not bear the profane, respectable lies of his own time. But it is a firm and an absolute no to his proposed solution, a no to the prideful, solitary, and ultimately idolatrous attempt to place the self on the empty throne of God, a no to a philosophy that seeks to replace the sacred dialogue between man and God with the lonely, heroic monologue of the overman. It is a rejection of a freedom that leads to isolation, in favor of a relationship that leads to a true and a holy community. These thinkers, then, saw Nietzsche not as the great Antichrist, but as one of the most tragic and most deeply religious figures in all of modern history. They saw him as a man who was so desperately and so passionately searching for God that in his failure to find him in the old, ruined temples of his time, he declared that God was dead, They saw him as a man who had been given a prophet's vision, but who had tragically misinterpreted the meaning of his own prophecy, and they saw him in the end as a brother, a fellow traveler in the dark night of the modern soul, a misunderstood prophet of the empty throne. We now arrive at a great and titanic confrontation in the history of German thought. A battle between two of the most powerful and most influential philosophical visions ever created. On one side, we have the sage of Königsberg, Immanuel Kant, the great champion of universal reason, of absolute duty, and of the unshakable dignity of all human beings, and on the other, the lonely prophet of the Engadine, Friedrich Nietzsche, the great champion of the exceptional individual, of the will to power, and of a radical, life-affirming break with all tradition. Their philosophies are the two opposing poles of the modern mind. To critique Nietzsche from a Kantian perspective is to subject his passionate, poetic, and often contradictory declarations to the cold, rigorous, and unforgiving light of pure, practical reason. It is to take the fiery, explosive energy of the artist and to test it against the universal, architectural logic of the lawgiver. The central point of collision, the place where their two worlds are utterly and completely irreconcilable, is the very concept of a universal moral law, the cornerstone of Kant's entire ethical system. As we have seen, Kant's entire moral philosophy is built upon the foundation of the categorical imperative, and its most famous formulation is the universal law, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is a principle of pure formal consistency, a test that any moral action must pass. It is a law that, by its very nature, must apply to all rational beings, at all times, in all places, without exception. For Kant, the very essence of morality is its universality. Nietzsche looks at this entire project with a profound and almost visceral contempt, the very idea of a single, universal morality. A one-size-fits-all law for every soul is, for him, the ultimate expression of herd morality. It is a fiction, a tool created by the weak, the mediocre, and the timid to hold back the strong, the noble, and the creative. He would argue that the demand that a master should live by the same rules as a slave is not just a mistake, it is a profound and a life-denying absurdity. For Nietzsche, there is no single morality. There are master moralities and slave moralities. The great, noble individual, the higher man, creates his own values, his own table of good and evil that flows from his own overflowing strength and his own unique perspective. His law is a law for himself. To ask him to universalize his maxim would be to ask him to betray his own exceptional nature. To lower himself to the level of the common herd, the very idea is a contradiction of his entire purpose. The conflict becomes even sharper when we consider the question of motive. For Kant, the only truly moral motive is the motive of duty. A pure, disinterested respect for the rational moral law. An act has moral worth only if it is done because it is the right thing to do, not because of any feeling or desired outcome, but Nietzsche sees this concept of a disinterested action as a psychological absurdity, a lie that philosophers tell themselves to disguise their own will. For Nietzsche, every action in the universe is an expression of the will to power. A noble person acts generously, not out of a cold sense of duty, but out of an overflowing feeling of their own power and spiritual wealth. Their virtue is a giving virtue, a natural and joyful expression of their own inner abundance. The Kantian idea of a good action performed without any inclination, without any joy, would be, for Nietzsche, the action of a spiritual corpse. A sad, gray, and life-denying morality fit only for accountants and clockwork puppets. But the most profound and most devastating clash comes when we consider Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, the humanity formula. This is the command to treat all of humanity in your own person and in the person of any other, always as an end in itself, and never merely as a means. This principle establishes the absolute, unconditional, and equal dignity of every single rational person. It is the philosophical bedrock of our modern conception of universal human rights. Nietzsche looks at this idea and sees the very heart of the slave morality that he so despised. He completely and totally rejects the idea that all human beings have an equal worth. For him, the vast majority of humanity, the herd, the superfluous ones, are not ends in themselves, they are the means. They are the raw material, the fertile soil, the bridge, upon which a new, higher type of human being, the overman, can be created. The purpose of the many is to serve as the foundation for the greatness of the few. From a Kantian, and indeed from a utilitarian perspective, this is a monstrous and a horrifying conclusion. It is a philosophy that explicitly sanctions the use of the vast majority of people as mere tools for the sake of a distant, aristocratic ideal. It is a rejection of the fundamental principle of compassion and mutual respect that makes a decent, humane society possible. A world governed by Nietzsche's principles would be a world without universal rights, a world where the strong would have a philosophical license to exploit the weak, a world of immense and unapologetic suffering for the many, in the name of the greatness of a few. The two philosophers also have completely irreconcilable visions of human freedom. For Kant, true freedom is autonomy, the freedom of a rational will to give the law to itself. But that law must be a universal one that all other rational beings could also assent to. It is a freedom that is inextricably bound to a sense of universal responsibility. It is a freedom under law. But for Nietzsche, true freedom is the freedom of the sovereign individual to stand above the law of the herd, to create his unique values, and to live by them without regard for any universal principle. It is a freedom from law. The Kantian critique, in the end, reveals Nietzsche's philosophy to be a form of radical and deeply dangerous irrationalism. By rejecting the principle of universality, Nietzsche has abandoned the very foundation of rational discourse and of a just cooperative society. His philosophy is a beautiful, powerful, and deeply seductive song, but it is a song for the solitary hero, for the lonely tyrant, for the exceptional individual. It is not, and can never be, a philosophy for a community of human beings who wish to live together in a state of mutual respect and peace. The choice between Kant and Nietzsche is in the end a choice between two of the most powerful and most incompatible visions of human dignity ever conceived. Do we find our ultimate worth in the one thing we all share, our universal rational nature and the common moral law that it provides for us, or do we find our ultimate worth in the one thing that makes us unique, our individual, creative power, to overcome the herd and to become the sole author of our own personal law, the great quiet man from Königsberg and the fiery lonely prophet of the Alps? Give us two completely different answers, and the tension between their two worlds continues to define the very heart of the modern age. We have now seen Nietzsche's philosophy challenged by the abstract formalism of Kant and the spiritual drama of the Christian tradition. But we now turn to a critique that is not concerned with logical consistency or the state of one's soul, but with the simple, practical, and deeply human question of real-world consequences. This is the critique from the perspective of utilitarianism, the great ethical tradition of thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and it is a philosophy that views Nietzsche's entire project not just as a mistake, but as a profound and a dangerous threat to the well-being of all humanity. Utilitarianism is at its heart a simple, powerful, and deeply compassionate idea. It argues that the ultimate foundation of all morality is the greatest happiness principle. This principle states that the morally right action in any given situation is the one that tends to produce the greatest amount of happiness or well-being for the greatest number of people, and to minimize the greatest amount of suffering. It is a profoundly democratic and egalitarian philosophy. For in its calculation, every single person's happiness counts, and it counts equally. From the very first step, this places it in a state of total and irreconcilable war with Nietzsche's entire worldview. For Nietzsche had nothing but a sneering contempt for the pursuit of happiness. Man does not strive for happiness, he famously declared, only the Englishman does that. He saw the desire for a comfortable, peaceful, and painless existence as the pathetic and life-denying ideal of the last man, a goal fit only for a timid and mediocre herd, not for a higher, nobler form of being. For Nietzsche, the goal of life is not happiness, but power. The feeling of growth, of struggle, of overcoming resistance. He believed that great individuals and great cultures are forged not in comfort, but in hardship. That suffering is a necessary and even a desirable condition for greatness. A utilitarian looks at this celebration of suffering and sees a profound and a dangerous perversion of values, a philosophy that has mistaken the disease for the cure. Suffering is not a good to be celebrated, it is the primary evil that a moral system should seek to eliminate. This fundamental conflict becomes even clearer when we look at the social and political implications of Nietzsche's thought. Utilitarianism, with its insistence that every person's happiness counts equally, is the natural philosophical ally of democracy, of social reform, and of universal human rights. It is a philosophy that is deeply concerned with the well-being of the community as a whole. But Nietzsche's philosophy is explicitly, proudly, and unapologetically anti-egalitarian and aristocratic. He does not believe that all people are of equal worth. On the contrary, he believes in a strict order of rank, a natural hierarchy that separates the few, noble, higher men from the vast common majority, the herd, and he is brutally clear about the relationship between these two groups. The purpose of the herd, he argues, is to serve as the foundation, the scaffolding, the raw material for the creation of a few, rare and exceptional individuals, the overmen. A utilitarian looks at this vision of society and sees the blueprint for a monstrous and an unforgivable tyranny. It is a system that is explicitly designed to sacrifice the happiness, the well-being, and the very lives of the many for the sake of the greatness of a few. It is a direct and a total rejection of the greatest happiness principle. It is a formula not for maximizing the good, but for maximizing the suffering of the majority in the name of a cold, aesthetic, and elitist idea. It is a world where the happiness of millions of lambs is seen as a fair price to pay for the beautiful, predatory glory of a single eagle. This is why Nietzsche reserved his most venomous attacks for the very emotion that lies at the heart of the utilitarian and the Christian worldview, the emotion of pity or compassion. He saw pity as the most dangerous of all the slave virtues, a weakness that preserves the unfit, that prolongs suffering, and that drains the vital energy of the strong. But from a utilitarian perspective, compassion is the very psychological engine of a moral society. It is the feeling that allows us to recognize the suffering of others as real and that motivates us to act to alleviate it. A society that teaches its members to despise pity, as Nietzsche does, is a society that is teaching its members to be indifferent to the suffering of their neighbors. It would be a world of profound and unchecked cruelty, a world where the strong would feel no moral compunction about trampling the weak. It would be a world that by its very design would produce an ever-increasing amount of misery. A world that is, from a utilitarian standpoint, the very definition of a failed state. The two philosophies, in the end, offer two completely incompatible visions of a perfect world. The utilitarian utopia is a world of peace, of security, of cooperation, a society that is rationally organized to provide the greatest possible level of comfort, health, and happiness for the largest number of its citizens. It is a world designed to minimize the suffering of the least fortunate. The Nietzschean utopia is a world of struggle, of danger, of inequality, a society that is designed as a breeding ground for genius, a great, beautiful, and terrible arena where the few great solitary heroes can rise to their full tragic height. The utilitarian critique of Nietzsche, then, is a simple and a devastating one. His philosophy, while perhaps containing brilliant psychological insights, is in its social and political implications a recipe for a brutal and a deeply unhappy world. It is a morality for predators, a celebration of the very egoism, cruelty, and indifference to suffering that a humane and a civilized society must always seek to overcome. It is a philosophy that in its relentless focus on the greatness of the few displays a profound and a terrifying disregard for the happiness of the many. It is the voice of a compassionate, democratic, and socially minded modernity, looking at Nietzsche's beautiful and dangerous aristocratic dream and concluding that the price of such greatness is simply not worth paying. For the goal of a truly noble philosophy, the utilitarian would argue, is not to create a few beautiful solitary eagles, but to create a world where the entire humble and deeply human flock can finally and truly flourish. We have now seen Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy challenged by the great traditions of the West, by the compassionate logic of the utilitarian, and by the absolute commands of the Kantian and Christian worldviews. But we now turn our critique eastward, to a tradition that Nietzsche himself held in a strange and complex kind of respect, a system of thought that he saw as a noble, logical, and deeply profound form of nihilism. This is the view from the perspective of Buddhism. Nietzsche often praised Buddhism. He saw it as far more realistic and intellectually honest than Christianity. It did not, he argued, rely on the resentful fictions of a personal God, of sin, or of a promised afterlife. Instead, it began with a clear, cold, and courageous diagnosis of the human condition. It was, in his eyes, a kind of passive nihilism for the strong, a noble and consistent system for a culture that was already tired and ancient, but in this very respect, we find the first and most profound point of opposition. The entire Buddhist project begins with the first noble truth, the simple, direct, and all-encompassing observation that life is dukkha, or suffering. This is not just the obvious suffering of pain, sickness, and death. It is a more subtle, pervasive feeling of unsatisfactoriness, of stress, of a fundamental dis-ease that is woven into the very fabric of our existence. For Buddhism, this suffering is the central problem that must be solved. But for Nietzsche, this same struggle, this same tension, this same pain is not a problem to be solved. It is a sign of life, a necessary condition for growth, for strength, and for greatness. The two philosophies begin with the same observation, that life is full of struggle and pain, but they immediately travel in two completely opposite directions. The Buddhist says, this is a sickness that must be cured, while Nietzsche says, this is a sign of health that must be affirmed and even intensified. This leads us to the second noble truth, the diagnosis of the cause of our suffering. For the Buddhist, the root of all dukkha is tanha, a word that translates as thirst, craving, clinging, or desire. It is our endless, grasping, and ultimately futile attempt to hold on to pleasure, to push away pain, and to assert the reality of our own ego. It is the constant, restless striving of the self that creates the friction, the stress, and the deep dissatisfaction that defines our lives. The path to liberation, therefore, must be a path that leads to the extinguishing of this craving. And it is here that the Buddhist critique of Nietzsche becomes truly devastating. For from a Buddhist perspective, Nietzsche's entire philosophy is a magnificent, poetic, and heroic glorification of tanha, what Nietzsche calls the will to power, the fundamental drive of all life to expand, to overcome, to grow, and to assert its own strength is, from a Buddhist standpoint, simply a more aggressive and more philosophical name for the very same craving that is the root cause of all our misery. It is a command not to extinguish the fire that burns us, but to pour gasoline upon it, to make it burn even brighter, even more intensely. It is a philosophy of perpetual, and ultimately self-inflicted, suffering. The two paths to salvation, then, could not be more different. The Buddhist path is the noble eightfold path, a gradual, systematic, and deeply practical training of the mind, a process of ethical conduct, of mental discipline, and of wisdom, all designed to slowly and carefully extinguish the flames of craving. Its ultimate goal is nirvana, a state of perfect peace, of unshakable tranquility, and of the final cessation of all suffering. It is a path of letting go. The Nietzschean path, on the other hand, is the path of the overman, a path of constant, effortful self-overcoming, a process of maximizing one's will, of embracing struggle, and of achieving greatness through the intensification of one's own desires and ambitions. Its ultimate goal is a state of triumphant life affirmation, a joyful yes to the endless, striving, and painful nature of existence. It is a path of holding on even tighter, of becoming more of a self, not less. The Buddhist seeks to become nothing, to realize the truth of no self, or anatta, while the overman seeks to become everything. From a utilitarian perspective, which seeks to maximize well-being and minimize suffering, Buddhism presents itself as the most radical and most consistent of all possible systems. It offers a clear and detailed methodology for the complete and total elimination of all forms of suffering. Its utility is the promise of a perfect and an unshakable peace. Nietzsche's philosophy, from this same standpoint, appears to be a recipe for a life of constant stress, of struggle, of conflict, and of deep existential dissatisfaction. It is a philosophy that seems to actively and joyfully maximize the very conditions that lead to suffering. Nietzsche, of course, would reject this entire framework. He would argue that the peaceful, desireless state of nirvana is a form of life denial, a noble suicide, a beautiful but ultimately weary retreat from the glorious, tragic, and exhilarating battle of existence. He would see the Buddhist tranquility not as a higher state of being, but as the final, most sophisticated expression of the exhausted will of the last man, a happiness that has been purchased at the cost of life itself. But the Buddhist would look back at Nietzsche's heroic striving and endlessly tormented overman, and with a quiet, unshakable compassion, he would see not a higher being, but simply another soul, trapped on the fiery wheel of his own becoming. A man who has brilliantly and correctly diagnosed the symptoms of his own raging fever, but who has tragically and fatally mistaken that fever for the cure. He would see a man who has become so completely identified with his own struggle that he cannot imagine a world without it. And so, we are left with two of the most profound and most powerful visions of the human condition ever conceived. One that sees life as a struggle to be overcome, and one that sees life as a struggle to be embraced. One that finds its ultimate meaning in the quiet, peaceful cessation of the will, and one that finds its ultimate meaning in the triumphant, joyful affirmation of that very same will. It is a choice between a final, sacred peace and a beautiful, terrible, and endless war. We have now arrived at the very summit of Friedrich Nietzsche's positive philosophy, the great and final answer to the abyss of nihilism, the Übermensch, or the Overman. He is the goal that is meant to replace God, the meaning of the earth, the creator of new life-affirming values, who will finally overcome the pathetic, comfort-seeking mediocrity of the last man. It is a powerful, a beautiful, and an exhilarating vision, one of the most inspiring ideals in the entire history of thought. But now, we must ask the cold, critical question: is it a real and achievable goal, or is it just a beautiful, but ultimately empty, poetic fantasy? The first and most persistent critique of the Overman is the profound and almost deliberate vagueness of the concept itself. Nietzsche tells us, with great passion, what the Overman does: he creates values, he affirms life, he loves his fate, but he is notoriously, and perhaps intentionally, silent on what the Overman actually is. He gives us no clear, concrete picture of this higher being, no detailed description of his character, his psychology, or his way of life. He remains a glorious but deeply abstract and endowy figure. His prophet, Zarathustra, a man who is himself only a bridge to the Overman, admits this. Never yet has there been an Overman, he declares. He points to great historical figures, to a Caesar, to a Napoleon, to a Goethe, as approximations, as hints of what is possible. But he is clear that none of them are the real thing. They are merely arrows, longings, for a future that has not yet arrived. This is a profound and a serious problem. If the Overman is the great new goal for all of humanity, but we have no clear idea of what it is we are striving for, then how can we ever hope to get there? It is like being a ship captain who is told to sail to a magnificent new world, but who is given no map, no coordinates, and not even a clear description of the land he is supposed to be looking for. The goal is inspiring, but without a clear destination, the journey is doomed to be a random and a hopeless wandering. This vagueness makes the ideal of the Overman feel less like a concrete philosophical project and more like a beautiful but ultimately undefined piece of religious or artistic yearning. This leads directly to the second great critique. If the destination is unclear, the roadmap is completely non-existent. Nietzsche tells us with a thunderous voice that we must overcome ourselves, that man is something that must be surpassed, but he offers no clear practical or systematic instructions on how to do this. Where is the step-by-step guide for the would-be Overman? Where are the spiritual exercises, the psychological disciplines, the practical rules for living that might lead one towards this higher state of being? Other great moral and spiritual systems provide such a path. Buddhism offers the Noble Eightfold Path, a detailed, systematic training of the mind. Christianity offers prayer, the sacraments, and a community of faith. Even the rationalist Kant offers the clear, logical test of the categorical imperative, but Nietzsche offers only poetic, paradoxical, and often contradictory commands. Become what you are. He tells us, what does not kill me makes me stronger. Live your life as a work of art. These are powerful, inspiring aphorisms. But they are not a practical program for self-transformation. From a utilitarian perspective, this lack of a clear path is a profound flaw. A philosophy that sets an impossibly high and ill-defined goal without providing any practical means to achieve it is a philosophy that is likely to produce more frustration, more self-loathing, and more suffering than it does genuine human flourishing. It is a recipe for a new kind of despair, the despair of the person who has been told they must become a god, but has been given none of the tools to do so. Its practical utility for improving the human condition is therefore deeply questionable. Furthermore, we must ask if the overman is even a psychologically possible or a desirable state for a human being. The overman is a being who has achieved a perfect mastery over his own passions, a being who loves his fate unconditionally, who feels no regret, and who would joyfully will the eternal repetition of his own life. With all of its deepest and most terrible sufferings, is this a realistic portrait of a higher form of humanity? Or is it a description of a beautiful monster, a creature who has overcome his own humanity to such an extent that he is no longer recognizable as one of us? His absolute affirmation of life, his amor fati, seems to require him to look upon the most horrific and unjust forms of suffering, both his own and that of others, and to declare them good and necessary. This leads to a kind of quietism, a passive acceptance of the world as it is, that seems to stand in direct opposition to the desire to make the world a better, more just and less cruel place. It is a state of being that is so far removed from our own deeply ingrained moral and compassionate instincts that it feels less like a goal and more like a strange and an alien pathology. Finally, there is the problem of the profound and inescapable solitude of the overman. He is a creator who stands alone, a solitary peak in a vast and a flat landscape of the herd. His entire project is a personal one, a dialogue with his own soul. Nietzsche's philosophy has almost nothing to say about community, about friendship, about politics, or about the difficult, practical business of how human beings are to live together. It is a philosophy for the hermit, for the artist in his attic, for the lonely prophet on his mountaintop. But how would a world of such solitary, self-legislating overmen even function? Would they respect each other's creations? Or would they be in a state of constant, glorious conflict, each one trying to impose his own will to power, his own table of values, on all the others? Nietzsche is almost completely silent on this question. His is a philosophy of the individual soul, but it is not a social or a political philosophy. It provides a powerful vision for how one might live, but it offers almost no guidance on how we might live together. And so, we are left with a profound and a deeply ambivalent critique. The overman is, without a doubt, one of the most powerful, most inspiring, and most artistically brilliant ideals in the entire history of philosophy. It is a heroic and a necessary no to the nihilism of the last man, and a passionate yes to the possibility of a new, more profound, and more meaningful form of human existence. It is a call to greatness that still echoes in the heart of our own tired and often cynical age. But as a practical, coherent, and achievable goal for humanity, it is deeply and perhaps fatally flawed. It is vague. It lacks a clear path. It may be psychologically impossible to achieve. And it is a fundamentally solitary and an antisocial ideal. The critique suggests that the overman, in the end, a poetic, a mythical, and a religious concept, not a philosophical or a practical one. It is a beautiful and a necessary dream for a world that has lost its old myths and its old gods. But a dream, no matter how beautiful, is not a plan. And the great, enduring, and still unanswered question that this critique leaves us with is whether Nietzsche, in his heroic and desperate attempt to give humanity a new earthly purpose, has in the end simply given us a magnificent, a powerful, and an ultimately empty fantasy. We have now seen the great, heroic goal of Nietzsche's philosophy, the overman, and we have found it to be a beautiful, inspiring, but perhaps a dangerously vague and an ultimately unattainable ideal. But now we must dig deeper. We must turn our critical eye away from the goal and towards the very engine that is meant to drive us there. This is his most famous, most central, and most persistently misunderstood concept, the great foundational principle of his entire worldview, the will to power. In our previous series, we explored the will to power as Nietzsche's great yes to the world, his description of the fundamental drive of all existence. It is the force that animates the active nihilist's hammer, the creative energy that the overman will use to forge new values. It is, in short, the very heart of his positive, life-affirming philosophy. But a critique of Nietzsche must ask a series of hard, uncomfortable questions. What, precisely, is this will to power? And is it a stable enough foundation upon which to build an entire new world? The first and most profound problem with the will to power is its deep and perhaps fatal ambiguity. At times, Nietzsche writes, as if it is a grand metaphysical claim, the inmost essence of being. A single, universal force that explains everything in the cosmos, from the growth of a plant to the orbit of a planet. But this immediately creates a profound contradiction with the rest of his philosophy. How can the great perspectivist, the man who declared that there is no truth, that there are no facts, only interpretation, then turn around and offer us his own single, universal truth, his own ultimate fact about the nature of reality? If all philosophy is just the personal confession of its author, a disguised manifestation of their own will, then Nietzsche's own philosophy of the will to power must be just that. His own personal interpretation, his own desire to see the world as a great, glorious struggle. It seems to be a new grand narrative, a new thing in itself, the very kind of metaphysical idol that he himself taught us how to smash with our hammers. He seems to be guilty of the very philosophical sin that he so brilliantly diagnosed in all of his predecessors. It is a stunning and perhaps a self-refuting internal contradiction. So perhaps we should not read it as a metaphysical claim, but as a scientific or psychological hypothesis, a claim about the basic, driving force of all living things. But here, it runs into a different and equally serious problem. As a scientific theory, it is completely and totally unfalsifiable. A good scientific theory must, in principle, be able to be proven wrong. But how could one ever design an experiment that could disprove the will to power? Its all-encompassing nature is its greatest weakness. Every conceivable human action can be reinterpreted as a manifestation of this single drive, an act of selfless charity that is the will to power feeling the pleasure of its own strength and superiority, an act of humble self-sacrifice that is the will to power turning its strength back upon itself, achieving a feeling of mastery over its own instincts, an act of brutal cruelty that is the will to power overcoming resistance. If a theory can explain everything, then, in the end, it explains nothing. It becomes a kind of philosophical dogma, an article of faith, not a useful tool for understanding human behavior. This very vagueness is what makes the concept not just philosophically problematic, but morally and politically dangerous, because the will to power is so ill-defined, it can be, and has been, used to justify almost any action, any ideology. The Nazis, as we have seen, twisted it into a crude justification for military conquest and racial domination. A radical individualist could use it to justify their own selfish egoism. A ruthless capitalist could use it to justify a predatory business model. It becomes a blank check, a philosophical permission slip for the strong to do whatever they wish to the weak. From a utilitarian perspective, a philosophical principle that is so dangerously ambiguous, so open to interpretations that can be used to justify immense human suffering, is a principle of profound disutility. A good, socially useful philosophy should provide clear, stable, and practical guidance for how to live together and to promote mutual well-being. But the will to power, in its magnificent and poetic vagueness, seems to do the exact opposite. It provides a powerful and an intoxicating justification for the very antisocial, predatory, and chaotic impulses that a stable and a happy society must seek to control. Perhaps then we should take a third, more charitable path. Perhaps the will to power is not meant to be a metaphysical truth or a scientific hypothesis at all. Perhaps it is best understood as a poetic metaphor, a powerful, artistic, and deeply personal way of redescribing the world, of looking at existence, not through the old tired lens of morality or mechanical causality, but through a new, more dynamic, more vital, and more artistic lens, its purpose. In this view is not to be true in the scientific sense, but to be inspiring, to be life-enhancing, to make us feel the great, creative, and tragic struggle of existence more deeply. This interpretation saves the concept from the charge of self-contradiction, but it does so at the cost of its philosophical power. It becomes a piece of art, a personal vision, a beautiful and a powerful poem about the nature of life. But it ceases to be a philosophy. It can inspire us, but it cannot guide us. It can offer us a new and a beautiful feeling about the world, but it cannot offer us a new and a stable foundation upon which to build our lives. And so, we are left with a deep and a troubling ambiguity at the very heart of Nietzsche's entire positive project. The will to power is the engine that is supposed to drive us beyond nihilism. It is the foundation upon which the great, new values of the Overman are to be built. But that foundation itself seems to be made of sand. It is a concept that is, at turns, a self-contradictory metaphysical claim, an unfalsifiable scientific hypothesis, and a beautiful but philosophically weak poetic metaphor. Nietzsche's great call for a new, life-affirming philosophy seems to rest upon a central concept that is itself unstable, undefined, and dangerously malleable. It is a will that seems to point everywhere and nowhere at once. A will to nowhere, a powerful, brilliant, and deeply intoxicating idea that in the end may be nothing more than a magnificent and a beautiful illusion, a final seductive idol from the very last philosopher to philosophize with a hammer. We have now arrived at the very summit of Nietzsche's philosophy, at the highest and most difficult spiritual state that he believed a human being could attain. It is his formula for the overman, his final triumphant yes to a godless and a meaningless universe. It is the concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate, and it is an idea of such breathtaking, radical, and almost inhuman courage that it has captivated and terrified thinkers for over a century. But now, we must ask the critical question, is this beautiful idea also a profoundly cruel one? Amor fati is not a simple acceptance of one's fate. It is not the grim stoic resignation to the inevitable. It is an active, joyful, and passionate love for everything that has ever happened and ever will happen. My formula for greatness in a human being, Nietzsche wrote, is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. It is the desire for every joy, every sorrow, every friend, every enemy, every triumph, and every mistake to be exactly as it was. And the ultimate test of this love, as we have seen, is the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence. The willingness to say yes, not just to this one life, but to the infinite, eternal, and unchangeable repetition of this one life. In all its minute and often agonizing detail, it is a thought of such immense and terrifying weight that it is meant to crush the weak and to elevate the strong. It is the final, definitive standard for a life that has been lived with absolute and unconditional affirmation. But it is here, at this very peak of his philosophy, that we encounter its most profound and most disturbing moral problem. For to will the eternal return of your own life, you must also will the eternal return of everything. You must will the eternal return of every war, every plague, every act of torture, and every moment of senseless cruelty that has ever occurred in the history of the world, for all of these things are a part of the great interconnected web of fate that has led to this present moment. This brings us back to the great unanswered challenge of Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov. Ivan looked at the world and saw the unforgivable suffering of a single innocent child, torn apart by dogs, and on the basis of that one unforgivable tear, he chose to return his ticket to God's creation. But Nietzsche's amor fati seems to demand the opposite. It seems to demand that we look at that very same terrible event and that we call it good, that we call it necessary, that we affirm it, that we love it as an essential part of the tapestry of existence that we would not change for anything. This appears to be a form of profound moral callousness, an aestheticization of suffering that completely ignores the reality of the victim. It is easy for the spectator, for the philosopher on his mountaintop, to look down at the tragic drama of the world and to find it beautiful and necessary, but it is a very different thing for the person who is actually living that tragedy. From this perspective, amor fati is not a courageous affirmation of life. It is a cruel and a terrible indifference to the real, concrete, and unforgivable suffering of others. This leads directly to a powerful political critique. If one must love fate, if one must will for everything to be exactly as it is, then what is the motivation for any kind of social or political change? Why would one fight against injustice? Why would one work to alleviate poverty? Why would one strive to create a more compassionate and a more peaceful world if one must at the same time love the very injustices, the very poverty, and the very conflicts that one is trying to overcome? It seems to be a profound and a paralyzing contradiction. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a deeply dangerous idea. The entire project of improving the human condition, of increasing well-being and reducing suffering, is predicated on the belief that the current state of the world is not perfect, that it ought to be changed. Amor fati, taken to its logical conclusion, seems to lead to a form of fatalism, a quietism, a conservative acceptance of the status quo, No matter how cruel or unjust it may be, it is a philosophy that seems to undermine the very motivation for the compassionate work that is necessary to make the world a better place. Finally, we must ask if this state of being is even psychologically possible for a human being. Is it truly possible for a person to achieve a state of such absolute affirmation that they feel no regret, that they would not change a single foolish or shameful moment from their past? Or is this, like the Overman himself, another of Nietzsche's beautiful but ultimately inhuman ideals, a goal so lofty that it can only serve to make real flawed and regretful human beings feel like failures? One could argue that the very capacity for regret, the painful feeling that things could have, and should have, been different, is a fundamental and a necessary part of what it means to be a moral being. Regret is the engine of self-improvement. It is the emotion that teaches, that forces us to learn from our mistakes, and that motivates us to become better people. To eliminate regret entirely might be to eliminate a crucial part of our own humanity, to become a beautiful but a static and an unteachable monster. The eternal recurrence, then, is a concept that is as problematic as it is powerful. As a cosmological claim about the universe, it is an unsubstantiated piece of metaphysics. As a psychological test, it is almost impossibly demanding. And as a moral imperative, live in such a way that you would wish to live this life again. It is a powerful call to live with purpose, but it is a call that seems to be grounded in the deeply questionable and potentially cruel foundation of amor fati. And so, we are left with the final, and most difficult, paradox of Nietzsche's thought. Amor fati and the eternal recurrence are, in many ways, the beautiful, poetic, and courageous culmination of his entire life-affirming project. They are his great and final yes to a world that he saw as being strangled by the life-denying no of 2,000 years of morality. But this great yes, we must conclude, comes at a terrible price. It is a yes that seems to demand a profound indifference to the suffering of others, a yes that can undermine the very will to make the world a better place, and a yes that may be psychologically impossible for any human being to truly and honestly utter. Friedrich Nietzsche despised politics. He had nothing but a profound and an aristocratic contempt for the state, which he famously called the coldest of all cold monsters. He loathed nationalism, calling it a sickness of the heart, and he mocked the petty herd-like squabbles of the political parties of his day. In his own mind he was an apolitical thinker, a man concerned not with the temporary arrangements of states, but with the eternal fate of the human soul, and yet no philosopher of the modern age has had a more explosive, more chaotic, and more dangerously ambiguous political legacy. The great and terrible paradox of Nietzsche's influence is that despite his own anti-political stance, his philosophy is perhaps the most politically potent and most easily weaponized in the entire history of thought. The very reasons for this are embedded in the critiques we have already explored: his ambiguous, aphoristic style, his rejection of objective truth, his celebration of power, and his aristocratic contempt for the masses, all combine to create a body of work that can be twisted to serve almost any political agenda, from the farthest right to the farthest left. We have already examined the most infamous of these misappropriations in detail. The way his sister and the Nazis took his ideas of the Overman and the will to power and turned them into a grotesque justification for racial supremacy and military conquest. But the crucial question is not just that it happened, but why his work was so uniquely susceptible to this kind of brutal distortion. The answer lies in the vocabulary he chose: his praise of the blonde beast, his talk of master and slave, his call for a new aristocracy, even if meant in a spiritual sense, provided a ready-made and a deeply seductive language for the politics of fascism. But the core of the political critique of Nietzsche goes much deeper than his historical association with the Nazis. It is a fundamental rejection of the very foundation of his worldview, his profound and unwavering anti-egalitarianism. Nietzsche does not believe that all human beings are created equal. This idea, which is the very bedrock of modern democracy and a core tenet of utilitarian thought, was, for him, the central lie of the slave morality, a fiction created by the weak to hold back the strong. He believed in a natural order of rank, a hierarchy of souls. His entire philosophy is an aristocratic one. It is a project designed for the creation of higher men, of noble solitary geniuses, who will stand above the great mediocre herd. This is the ultimate source of his political danger, for if you do not believe in the equal worth of all individuals, then you have no firm ground on which to build a just and a humane society. His philosophy, by its very nature, devalues the well-being of the vast majority of people, seeing their happiness, their security, and even their lives as a fair price to pay for the creation of a few and beautiful souls. From a utilitarian perspective, which holds that the goal of a society should be to produce the greatest amount of well-being for the greatest number of people, Nietzsche's vision is a moral and a political catastrophe. It is a blueprint for a society that would actively cultivate inequality and suffering. A world where the happiness of the many is seen as a trivial concern when compared to the greatness of the few. It is a direct and a total assault on the very idea of the common good, the central pillar of any functional and compassionate society. But the political ambiguity of Nietzsche is so profound that he has not only been an inspiration for the far right, he has also been a powerful and an enduring influence on the radical left. Many anarchists and post-Marxist thinkers have been drawn to his ferocious critique of the state, of religion, and of all forms of bourgeois herd morality. His call for a transvaluation of all values can be read not just as a spiritual project, but as a call for a total and a violent social and political revolution, a complete smashing of the existing order. His philosophy, then, is a kind of political wildcard, a source of inspiration for anyone who feels themselves to be in a state of rebellion against the established order. He can be the hero of the fascist who wants to create a new aristocracy, and he can be the hero the anarchist who wants to destroy all forms of authority. This profound ambiguity is a testament to the power of his critique, but it is also a testament to the deep irresponsibility at the heart of his political thought. He provides the dynamite, but he offers no clear instructions on how it should be used, or by whom. The central problem is his very concept of power, because he makes the will to power the ultimate and only standard of value, and because he rejects all external, universal moral laws, like Kant's categorical imperative or the Christian law of love. There is nothing in his system to constrain or to guide the actions of his higher men. There is no principle of justice to protect the weak. There is no concept of universal rights to shield the individual from the will of the strong. There is only power and the assertion of that power. And so, we must ask the final difficult question: was Nietzsche, in the end, an irresponsible philosopher? Did he, with his beautiful poetic and deliberately ambiguous style, fail to put adequate safeguards on his own explosive ideas, knowing the immense potential they had for destruction? Did he, in his aristocratic contempt for the political world, fail to see that his ideas would inevitably be dragged into that very world, with the most terrible of consequences? The critique suggests that the answer is yes, that his profound lack of concern for the social and political consequences of his thought is a deep and an enduring moral failure. His political legacy, then, is one of profound and of dangerous ambiguity. He is not, in the strict sense, a political philosopher, but he is the source of some of the most potent, most challenging, and most destructive political ideas of the modern age. His work remains a permanent and a necessary challenge to all stable political orders, a timeless source of inspiration for radicals of all stripes, and a terrible, enduring warning about what happens when the heroic pursuit of individual greatness becomes completely and tragically detached from a compassionate concern for the common good. We have journeyed through the great abstract philosophical systems. We have wrestled with the heroic demands of Nietzsche and the anxious freedom of the existentialists. But we now bring our critique down from the heights of philosophy and into the most intimate and most painful of all arenas, the individual human psyche. For nihilism is not just a theory, it is a lived and often a deeply painful psychological condition. It is the quiet, gnawing despair of a life that has been stripped of all meaning, purpose, and value. In the language of modern psychology, this state has many names. It is the anomaly described by the sociologist Emil Durkheim, a sense of normlessness and social disconnection. It is the feeling of alienation that is a central theme of Marxism, a separation from one's work, from one's community, and from oneself, and it is the core of what is often called existential depression, a profound sadness that is rooted not in a chemical imbalance, but in a confrontation with the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. It is a sickness of the soul. From a utilitarian perspective, this is the ultimate and most personal form of disutility. It is a state of profound and persistent suffering that drains life of all its joy, all its motivation, and all its color. A society where this feeling is widespread is a society in a state of deep and dangerous crisis. For a life without a sense of meaning is a life that is barely lived at all. The great question, then, is not just how do we refute nihilism, but how do we heal from it? And for one of the most powerful answers to that question, we must turn to a man who confronted the absolute worst of humanity and emerged with a profound and an enduring hope. His name was Viktor Frankl, a brilliant psychiatrist from Vienna, who was imprisoned for 3 years in the Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He was a man who lived through the absolute real-world manifestation of a nihilistic ideology, a world designed to strip human beings of their dignity, their hope, and their very identity. He was a witness to, and a victim of, the most orphaned suffering imaginable. And it was in this terrible laboratory of despair that he made his most important and most life-affirming discovery. In his monumental book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl recounts his observations. He noticed that in the camps, the prisoners who were most likely to survive were not necessarily the ones who were the physically strongest or the healthiest, but were the ones who held on to a sense of meaning, a purpose for their lives. It might be the hope of being reunited with a loved one, it might be a creative work they felt they still needed to finish, or it might be a deep religious faith, but those who had a why to live for could bear almost anyhow. This observation became the foundation of his entire psychological school, which he called logotherapy, and at its heart is a direct and a powerful critique of the other great psychological theories of his time. He argued that Sigmund Freud, with his focus on a will to pleasure, and Alfred Adler, with his focus on a will to power, had both missed the most fundamental and most powerful of all human motivations. For Frankl, the primary drive in all human beings is a will to meaning. He argued that a life without meaning is the primary source of our psychological distress, a condition he called the existential vacuum, a state of deep boredom, apathy, and a feeling that one's life is ultimately pointless. This, he said, was the great, unspoken neurosis of the modern age, a condition that could lead to depression, to addiction, and to aggression. The only true cure for this sickness of the soul, he believed, was not to analyze the past, but to discover a meaning for the future. But how do we find this meaning in a world that, as the nihilists have so powerfully argued, seems to have none to offer? Here, Frankl offers a profound and a deeply practical answer. He argues that meaning is not something we invent out of nothing, as Sartre might suggest, nor is it a grand, superhuman project for a solitary overman, as Nietzsche envisioned. Instead, meaning is something we discover in the world, through our own lived experience, and he outlines 3 primary paths to this discovery. The first path is by creating a work or by doing a deed. We can find a profound sense of meaning in our work, in our creativity, and in our contributions to the world. This is the meaning that comes from dedicating ourselves to a task that is greater than ourselves, from using our unique talents to make the world a slightly better place. It is the path of action and of accomplishment. The second, and perhaps more powerful path, is by experiencing something or by encountering someone. We can find a deep and an abiding meaning in the experience of goodness, of truth, and of beauty, in the appreciation of nature or of art. But the most profound experience of all, he says, is the experience of love. To love another human being, he writes, is to see the very essence of their person, to grasp what is unique and essential within them. And in this act of loving communion, we find one of life's most powerful and most enduring meaning. And the third path is the most difficult and the most profound of all. We can find meaning, Frankl insists, in the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering, even when we are faced with a hopeless situation that we cannot change, like an incurable disease or the reality of a concentration camp. We still have one final and ultimate freedom. The freedom to choose our attitude in any given set of circumstances, the freedom to choose our own way. We can find a meaning in the way we bear our cross, a meaning that can turn a personal tragedy into a triumphant victory of the human spirit. Viktor Frankl's philosophy, born in the very heart of the abyss, is a quiet, courageous, and deeply humanistic antidote to the grand, heroic, and often inhuman proclamations of nihilism. He does not offer a new, abstract theory. He offers a practical, therapeutic path back to a meaningful life. His work is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a powerful and an empirically grounded argument that our search for meaning is not a childish illusion to be overcome, but is, in fact, our greatest, most essential, and most powerful strength. He provides a final, and perhaps the most powerful, critique of Nietzsche, for he shows that in a world of absolute suffering, the will to power is not enough. The will to live is not enough. The only thing that can see a person through the darkest of nights is the will to meaning. It is a philosophy that turns away from the solitary, prideful overman and towards the loving, connected, and responsible human being. A vision that finds the ultimate purpose of life, not in the overcoming of others, but in the service of them and in the quiet, heroic dignity of our own unbreakable human spirit. We have now reached the end of our long and difficult journey. We have walked with Nietzsche through the twilight of the idols. We have stared with him into the abyss of a godless universe, and we have wrestled with his heroic, dangerous, and beautiful vision for a new kind of humanity. But we have not walked as disciples. We have walked as critics. We have subjected his thought to the logical rigor of Russell, the spiritual anguish of Dostoevsky, the universal demands of Kant, and the compassionate calculus of the utilitarians. And now, we are left with one final and all-important question. What is the final verdict? After all the critiques have been heard, after all the flaws have been exposed, what are we to make of this brilliant, terrible, and inescapable philosopher? Is his work a cure for the sickness of the modern soul, or is it a more potent and more seductive form of the sickness itself? The answer, like the man himself, is a profound and a difficult paradox. For Nietzsche's philosophy is, in the end, best understood as a necessary poison. It is a medicine that, if taken in the right dose, can save us, but if taken too freely, can just as easily destroy us. Let us first be clear about the poison. We have seen that Nietzsche's philosophy, if taken as a literal, practical blueprint for society, is a recipe for a monstrous and an unhappy world. His unapologetic elitism, his contempt for the herd, and his rejection of the principle of equal human dignity is a direct assault on the foundations of a just and a compassionate society. His dream of a world that exists for the sake of its higher men is a nightmare for everyone else, a formula for a new and more terrible kind of tyranny. We have seen how his attack on pity and compassion as life-denying weaknesses undermines the very emotions that drive us to help the suffering and to build a better, kinder world. We have seen how his core concepts, the overman and the will to power, are so dangerously vague and so poetically ambiguous that they can be, and have been, twisted to justify the most brutal and most inhuman of political projects. And we have seen how his own profound misogyny and his aristocratic prejudices reveal the deep and troubling limits of his own vaunted perspective. From a utilitarian standpoint, a world built on Nietzschean principles would be a world of catastrophic disutility, a world of immense and unapologetic suffering for the many, justified by the abstract, aesthetic greatness of a few. It is, in its social and political implications, a profoundly dangerous and a deeply irresponsible philosophy. It is a poison that, if allowed to infect the body politic, leads not to a higher state of being, but to a state of perpetual, brutal, and unjust conflict. And yet it is a necessary poison, for Nietzsche was, without a doubt, the most courageous and most insightful diagnostician of the spiritual sickness of the modern age. He was the man who dared to announce the death of God, not as a distant, abstract possibility, but as a lived psychological reality, a tremendous event that would change everything. He was the one who understood that this event would unleash a new and terrifying plague upon the world, the plague of nihilism, the collapse of all meaning, purpose, and value. He was a psychologist of almost supernatural depth, his unmasking of the hidden, resentful motives behind our most cherished moral values, his concept of resentment, his understanding of the slave revolt in morality. These are permanent and indispensable tools for anyone who wants to understand the human soul. With a true and an unflinching honesty, he cleared away centuries of hypocrisy and self-deception, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable and often ugly truths that lie beneath our civilized surfaces. And most importantly, he is the great philosopher of life affirmation. In a world that was growing tired, that was sinking into the comfortable, blinking oblivion of the last man, Nietzsche offered a powerful, heroic, and exhilarating yes to life. A yes that did not shrink from the terror, the suffering, and the chaos of existence, but embraced it as a necessary and even a beautiful part of a great tragic and magnificent whole. He is the ultimate antidote to the weary, passive nihilism that he saw as the greatest danger of our time. So how do we reconcile these two things? The dangerous, poisonous ideologue and the necessary, life-affirming physician of culture. The answer is that we must learn to read him critically, to take from him what is life-enhancing and to reject what is toxic. He does not give us a new table of values that we can simply accept. He gives us a hammer and challenges us to create our own, a task that is as liberating as it is dangerous. His philosophy is not a destination, it is a crucible, a trial by fire that we must pass through. To read Nietzsche well is not to become a Nietzschean, it is to become more suspicious of all easy answers, all comforting dogmas, all herd mentalities, including the temptation to turn his own ideas into a new and an unthinking herd. It is to learn to think for ourselves, to take on the immense responsibility of creating our own meaning, while never forgetting the profound and deeply un-Nietzschean duty of compassion for the others who are engaged in that same difficult struggle. His legacy, in the end, is that of a great and a necessary challenge. He is the embodiment of the most profound and most dangerous questions of the modern age, and we cannot simply ignore him. To do so would be to succumb to the very spiritual laziness that he so despised. We must instead learn to handle his philosophical dynamite with the caution, the wisdom, and the critical respect that it deserves. We must learn to take the poison as a medicine, in a small, careful, and life-saving dose. For he is the great, dark, and necessary prophet of our time, the thinker who showed us the full depth of the abyss, but who also gave us a vision of the strength, the creativity, and the courage that we would need to not just survive it, but to dance upon its very edge, a dance that is the most difficult, most dangerous, and most beautiful task of the modern human soul.